Welcome to Come to Think of It, a program where we talk about things that matter. I'm your host, Casey Scott. My guest today is, once again, Roget Lockard, an addictions counselor. We are having a series of discussions on the nature of addiction, and this, I think, is our 18th in this series. Roget, welcome back.
Thanks, Casey.
Now, when we concluded our last program, we had just started talking about something you referred to as the 5 levels of trust. And I want to go back to that since we left it sort of hanging and see if we can pick that up a little.
Sure. And I think I'll go back all the way to the beginning for the simplicity of it and not dwell on it. But these 5 levels of trust characterize the journey of sobriety, beginning at the very beginning, at the crucial moment when the addict is doing without the object of their addiction, and their existential state is such that they feel like, well, I can't survive without this. That's what it's come to. And
I just want to interrupt you for a second, because you said the object of addiction, which I just want to go back to something that you mentioned early on, and that is that we are more addicted with than addicted to. So,
well, I appreciate your following me on that fine point, but I'm not sure we're going to persuade the culture at large to go along with that. But I'm glad you were paying attention. The technology around which the addiction is organized. That when that's missing, it feels like existence is no longer viable. And so the first level of trust is as primitive as you can get, and that is, I'm still here. I am is the raw articulation of it. And the second level of trust emerges in the area where the experience of powerlessness has resided. Powerlessness/helplessness, the sense that I cannot make effective choices with respect to certainly my life in general, but in particular my relationship with this addictive entanglement. But if we're indeed on the path of sobriety, we get the message by example, by articulation, that one of the central tricks of this journey is to just do it for one day. And we discovered that in following that recommendation, as simple-minded and idiotic and unpromising as it seems at first glance, that we can in fact make effective choices, that over the course of a consecutive 1 days at a time, they add up to a track record that is more effective than anything we've been able to do for a long time. So I think that may be as far as we got.
I think so.
In the last conversation. The last 3 levels are an evolution of our relationship with the experience of love. And the first one is opening to the realization that comes about necessarily in the context of community, fellowship, whatever you want to call it. And quite simply, and the conventional articulation of it would be, I can be loved. But the germane articulation of it would be, I can be loved. Again, I think somewhere back in the archives of our meetings, we may have touched on this before, but it sure bears repeating. That is to say, not the me that I put out there to persuade you that I'm worthy of love and so forth, but the actual me that brings the history and the characterological flaws and so forth. That version of me can be loved because I experience it happening and I watch other people doing it with other flawed, frail addicts in sobriety, on the path of sobriety. And I find myself doing it as well as time goes on, of loving them in return. So that's the third level of trust, and the first of the three levels having to do with love. I can be loved. The fourth level, and at one time I thought it was the final level, was I am loved. It's a growing experience of inhabiting the world in a state where there are people who love you, but with the gathering of time, we begin to feel that the universe itself, that the world welcomes us. And that's certainly not how we have felt for a long time. No, although many people will report that that's how they felt when they were in the initial stages of their addictive entanglement. That's what drew them in. It's very much an important part of what drew me in, was that sense that I had, that not only that I fit in the universe, but there was something welcoming. And
but by the time you get to the bottoming out point, the universe has become quite adversarial.
Yeah, I mean, at its best, coldly neutral and indifferent, but often enough seemingly adversarial. Exactly. So I am loved as just a given. I don't mean unfailing every second of every day, but an experience that you can come back to and re-engage with. And people associate that experience with different spiritual practices, meditation practices, whatever. It doesn't matter how you get there. The point is you can get there. And as I say, in my first articulation of these levels of trust, that was the last one. But in a conversation with a friend of mine who was interviewing me about that particular paper, as I was running down the list, I said, wait a second, there's one more. And we arrive at the last level of trust by simply jettisoning the last letter of the preceding level of trust. That is to say, I am loved becomes I am love. That is the essential nature of my being. And I'm not going to try and really theorize about it. I suspect that people will recognize it, or perhaps they won't, but they will be intrigued or provoked.
Well, two observations here. One is that it kind of turns the fourth level around from receiving to giving. And the other thing is that if you say, I am love, that pretty well resolves the existential crisis of self that we've been talking about all along, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the thing about giving, that's a nice point. I have a gesture that I've used for a long time to help convey my sense of love, and it is simply this. It has the quality of offering and of receptivity. And with no strings attached, no hooks.
Yes.
Once you add hooks, then we're talking a business deal.
Yeah, then it's about control again.
Right, and some business deals are perfectly fine, and some of them are more problematic. But anything with hooks in it, the love is compromised. So those are the levels of trust.
So it's love. What I'm getting from this is that love ultimately is this the key to recovery or the result of recovery?
Both.
Or either or both.
Yeah.
So in this context, you mentioned off camera the overwhelming response to the death of Robin Williams, which I think is a fascinating example of how this thing plays out in terms of, I don't know exactly how that fits into the process of recovery, but I certainly see it in the process of addiction. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
About that. I'd be very happy to. Like pretty much everybody I know, I was deeply impacted and moved at the news of that event.
We're taping very shortly after the event, within a week or so. Yeah.
Right. And always my experience of Robin has been that he is a paragon, if you will. He is a prime exemplar of addictive process, of the what's at stake, what are the issues, what's involved in resolving the addictive predicament into states of sobriety. You remember, of course, that I constantly come back to the language referring to how addiction in its initial presentation offers a conspicuously superior solution to what I call the problem of self. Mm-hmm. In all honesty, I cannot think of an individual who embodied a more urgent, apparently unceasing grappling with the problem of self, and I would have to say in Robin's instance, not to be cute, the problem of selves. Mm-hmm. Because he would run through, as we all know, he would run through a dozen iterations of his self in 90 seconds. Mm-hmm. And it always struck me as having the quality of a search. So somewhere in here is, am I in here, or am I everywhere in here? It also is unmistakable for me that his search was to love and be loved, and to love all the different renderings of himself that crowded in upon him. And my sense is that he reached a stage where the effort, that, you know, we learned that he was in the early stages of Parkinson's. Mm-hmm. And had been grappling with, as usual, very severe depression, and had recent relapses. And my guesstimate is that he experienced a degree of discouragement that was intolerable. And I don't know if this has come up in our prior conversations, but the word courage and its branching words like discourage and encourage has become enriched for me ever since I noticed quite a while ago that it emerges out of kur, mm-hmm. which means heart.
Yes.
So when I think of Robin Williams being discouraged, I don't think of him, oh, bummer, you know. Mm. I think of him feeling like, do I have the heart for this? Mm. And he had an amazing
disheartened,
heart.
Yes.
Disheartened, yes. Exactly, yeah. You know, am I up for this? Do I have the vital juice? And my impression was that he came to that particular day when the answer was no, I don't. Mm-hmm. You know, often we hear about and construe people's suicides as being, you know, some kind of a angry curse, or you know, people commit suicide at people.
I don't think so.
That people do that?
Well, I don't think that's the most common form.
Well, I think it's
certainly not in my experience.
Yeah. It's I wouldn't propose to sort it out, but I think it's not uncommon. But in any case, I don't think it's what happened with Robin. I didn't get that sense at all that he, we talk about getting drunk at people. And I don't know if Robin ever did that, but I don't think that's what happened here. But I have the sense that because of who he was and how he wore himself, and the copious record that he's left behind, that there's a lot of positive potential for Robin to become a kind of what's the word that I want? A torch embodying the striving for sobriety.
I want to say icon, but that doesn't envelop
it's sort
the
of
concept that you're getting at.
Well, it reminds me of another aspect of our pre-camera conversation, where I observed that the last time I can remember there being this much tumult about the death of a public figure was the death of Princess Diana. But that in her case, not to take anything away from who she was as a person, and there was a great deal of that, obviously, but she was the princess.
Yes.
Had she not been the princess, then there would have been a tragedy, there would have been whatever it was, but it would not have resonated globally the way that it did. It was hugely about the myth, the iconic magnitude. And in Robin's case, I think it's about the man, much more than any myth about him.
Well, you talk about the importance of this, and I want to come back to our conversation about the fact that we live in an addictive culture, and you see this outpouring of love for Robin as an encouraging sign. I think there's a lot of we see ourselves in Robin, and that was always his appeal, was it not? I'm reminded of the story of Charlie Chaplin meeting Albert Einstein, and they only met once, but it is reported that Chaplin said, "The world applauds me because they understand me, and they applaud you because they don't understand you."
Yes. Well, you know what? That's very much in keeping with the thought that I had when you said the people loved Robin because they saw themselves in him. And I had the reaction, yes, and because they don't see, that is, they see someone whose deftness, whose ability to keep all of the things spinning and somehow land, with them all in his grasp, or with them not all in his grasp, but gracefully. That it was both, as you were suggesting, the ways with Einstein and Chaplin, it was the ways in which we saw ourselves in him and the ways in which we saw him as being able to take those struggles, those contradictions to a whole different level.
We have been talking, and ultimately want to come back to the crisis that we face as a species now, and it is not difficult to see this as a result of an absence of love. in the broadest sense. And I don't want to get sappy here. I mean, it's not like all you need is love, da 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 da. But you wrote a paper once on this topic of love that we were talking about earlier, and that I think would be a very fruitful place to go at this point.
Well, I'm gonna do the what do you call it? The Cliff Notes.
Yes.
Rendering of it.
Right.
Because
exactly.
We have a lot of important things to cover, especially at this stage where we're moving into talking about the large systems. But I completely agree with you that if we're going to talk about love and we're going to somehow set that up as the centerpiece, the throbbing heart of the whole business,
which I believe it is.
As do I. It deserves a little fleshing out, a little specificity. The paper that you're referencing is called Love and Sobriety. And in the beginning, I describe how, in my work as a therapist, I'm constantly striving / hoping for my clients to fall in love with sobriety. And I go on to say that, as I've mentioned in earlier programs, the most satisfactory definition of sobriety that I've ever come up with, encountered, and many people have observed this over time, is sobriety is the ability to show up for life. So if I'm going to then work from that premise, then if I'm saying I want people to fall in love with sobriety, I'm essentially saying I want them to fall in love with life. And it turns out that's true. That's what I do want. For myself, for you, and for everyone. So what is love then? And like I'm going to come up with the definitive answer after millennia of brilliant poets and philosophers and psychologists and so forth. No, I'm not. But one of the psychologists...
And spiritual leaders.
And spiritual leaders.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, them too.
Yeah.
One of the psychologists, or psychiatrists, I think, was Scott Peck, who wrote the very well-regarded and justly well-regarded book, The Path Less Traveled, The Road Less Traveled, and subsequent books, but that's his classic, and I think his major contribution. In there, he offers a characterization of love that I took some exception to. So rather than get into that little mental tiff I had with him, I want to share the challenge that I made to myself, which was, okay, if you're going to disagree with this gentleman who's very highly regarded and so forth, what's your definition or characterization of love, Roget? And one of the things that Scott had indicated was that real love doesn't take place between people and animals, or people and objects, or abstract things like poetry and so forth.
I love this painting.
Yeah, well, and that can be very trite.
Yeah.
And it can be very true.
Yes.
Is my perspective. But that can be trite or true about almost any object we think of, for that matter. But so I gave myself a little meditative exercise, because I have had the experience of loving trees. I have even, I confess, hugged trees to great advantage. And so I just held still and went inside the experience of loving a tree. I had a particular tree in mind down at Watershops Pond in Springfield. And the first thing that occurred to me was that with anything that I love, there is an unconditional experience of acceptance. That doesn't mean I approve of everything. There may be a lot that I don't approve of with a problematic friend or person or something like that. But the love is not conditional. So that helped. That was a step in the right direction, but it was far from summing it up. because I unconditionally accept this pen. I'm not in the state of spiritual exaltation where I experience love for the pen. So
you don't have the right pen. That's
yeah. So I held still with it a bit more, and I realized, it came to me that with anything I love, there is a way in which it becomes included with myself, if that makes sense. The word that worked for me was there's an embrace, maybe physical embrace, but I have had some wonderful experiences loving a poem, and I don't physically embrace the poem, but I very much embrace it in my heart. So closer, but not all the way yet. So all the way for me turned out to be the realization that with anything I love, I go bravo that this one is in the universe. And that bravo seemed most adequately served with the word celebration. So when I added those three together, acceptance, embrace, and celebration, unconditional in all three cases, that's the characterization of love that I recommend.
Where that takes me, and I mentioned this to you before, but where that takes me is to science, and the fact that the more we know scientifically about the way reality is constructed, the more we understand that the edges are really fuzzy, that everything is pretty much everything, and that I'm part of everything. And that, what that does, I mean, at the most fundamental level, you know, the particles and waves and electromagnetism, you know, what all of these things, there's not a whole lot of differentiation when you get down to that level. And what that tells me is to accept what is, everything that is. And that includes the ugly things, the things that I don't like. It's all, and that's a basic principle of sobriety, is it not?
Excuse me. Well, it is for me. I think we've touched on it, but you know, many people have done various versions of the simple proposition: what is, or more rhetorically or polemically, every time you argue with what is, you lose. So another way, a very succinct way that I have of thinking about what is love, and I think I've mentioned it in prior programs, is that love is a reaching for wholeness. And your description of your sense of the universe ultimately being this great
Continuum
that continues off into mysterious domains that are far beyond our grasp when we realize that most of the matter and most of the energy in the universe is unperceivable by us.
Yes.
It's like, wow.
Wow, indeed, and that's where we're going to have to leave it for now, Roget, because we are out of time. But that really brings us to the discussion that we need to have about the current crisis.
Splendid.
And I'm very, very pleased to have had you here. Well,
my pleasure.
And look forward to our next conversation. And thank you for being with us on Come to Think of It. I hope you'll be with us next time. Until then, drive cheerfully. I'm Casey Scott.